Indian billionaire marries obese maid due to a bet. On their wedding night, he discovers something that left him jaw-dropped. Welcome to Billionaires and Hearts. Before we dive into today's emotional journey, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to stay updated. We'd love to hear your first impressions, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think as you watch. And if you enjoy our stories, please like and share this video with your friends. Now let's get started. Bruno Patel stared at his reflection in the mirror of his luxurious penthouse bathroom, adjusting his imported silk tie with trembling fingers. This was not how he had imagined his wedding day. The successful tech mogul had always pictured himself marrying someone from his social circle, perhaps the daughter of another wealthy family or a sophisticated model. Instead, in less than an hour, he would be saying, "I do," to Sarah Thompson, one of his housekeepers. "You look like you're about to be sick," Ian Matthews commented from the doorway, a glass of scotch in his hand and an amused smirk on his face. As Bruno's closest friend and the mastermind behind this whole situation, he was thoroughly enjoying the billionaire's discomfort. "This is insane," Bruno muttered, turning to face his friend. "We can call it off. I'll pay double the bet." Ian's smile widened. "A bet is a bet, my friend. You said there was no way I could secure that contract with the Japanese investors. You were so confident that you wagered you'd marry the next person I chose. Well, I got the contract, and I chose Sarah." Bruno ran his fingers through his perfectly styled hair, remembering that fateful night at the club when too much alcohol and his oversized ego had led to this predicament. He had never imagined Ian would succeed in closing that impossible deal, let alone that he would choose Sarah as his bride. Sarah Thompson was everything Bruno typically avoided in a potential partner. She was a plus-sized woman from a humble background who worked as part of his household staff. He had barely noticed her existence before Ian's choice forced him to actually look at her. The few interactions they'd had since the arrangement was made had been awkward and strained. "Have you even had a proper conversation with her?" Ian asked, his tone shifting from amusement to something more serious. "What's there to talk about? This is a business arrangement. She gets financial security, and I fulfill my obligation to the bet. In a year, we'll have a quiet divorce and everyone moves on." Ian shook his head. "You're really something else, Bruno. Has it occurred to you that she might be more than just her appearance or her job title?" Before Bruno could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from his father, Edward. The older Patel patriarch had been furious when Bruno announced his engagement to a housekeeper. The message was brief but cutting. "This mockery of marriage will destroy everything we've built." Bruno deleted the message without responding. His father's empire had been built on strategic marriages and social connections. This wedding would indeed be a scandal in their circles, but Bruno's own success had made him untouchable. His tech innovations had multiplied the family fortune many times over. Meanwhile, in a smaller room of the same luxury building, Sarah Thompson sat quietly as her mother, Claire, helped her with the wedding dress, a designer piece that cost more than their family had ever seen. Sarah's hands were folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to go through with this, sweetheart," Claire said softly, adjusting the veil. "We've managed all these years. We'll keep managing." Sarah caught her mother's reflection in the mirror. Claire had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families all her life, just as Sarah did now. They had always lived on the edges of luxury, cleaning up after those who had everything while barely making ends meet themselves. "I know what I'm doing, Mum," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. What she couldn't tell her mother was that this arrangement was about more than just money. She had secrets of her own. Secrets that made this bizarre marriage of convenience necessary for reasons beyond financial security. As she stood up, smoothing down the expensive fabric of her dress, Sarah thought about the contract she had signed the previous week. 1 year of marriage, complete discretion, and a generous settlement at the end. It seemed simple enough on paper. Yet there was nothing simple about the way her heart raced whenever she caught Bruno looking at her, with those confused, slightly disdainful eyes, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. The wedding was set to be a small private affair, no press, no extended family, just the necessary witnesses. Bruno had insisted on this, wanting to minimize the social fallout. Sarah had agreed, though not for the reasons he assumed. As the hour approached, Sarah took one final look in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her was transformed by the expensive dress and professional styling, but underneath it all, she was still the same person who had worked hard all her life, who had learned to keep her head down and her secrets close. What no one knew, not even her mother, was that Sarah had been quietly working towards something for years, something that would change everything. And this marriage, as bizarre and uncomfortable as it was, might be the key to finally achieving it. The wedding march began to play in the penthouse's private ceremony space. Bruno stood at the makeshift altar, his expression stoic. As Sarah prepared to walk down the aisle, she took a deep breath and touched the small locket hidden beneath her dress, a reminder of why she was really here. Neither the billionaire nor his reluctant bride realized that this marriage, born of a reckless bet and desperate secrets, would soon unravel in ways neither of them could have anticipated. For now, they were two strangers about to become husband and wife, each carrying their own hidden burdens and private motivations into this most unusual union. Little did Bruno know that his new bride's secrets would soon turn his carefully ordered world upside down, starting with their very first night as husband and wife. The wedding ceremony passed in a blur of formal words and tense smiles. Bruno barely looked at Sarah as they exchanged rings, his jaw tight with barely concealed discomfort. The small gathering of witnesses, Ian, Claire, and a handful of necessary staff, watched the unlikely couple with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. After the brief reception, Bruno and Sarah found themselves alone in his penthouse. The awkwardness between them was palpable as they stood in the vast living room still in their wedding attire, like actors who had forgotten their lines after the curtain rose. "Jad, your room is down the hall," Bruno said stiffly, loosening his tie. "I had the staff prepare it for you. We may be married on paper, but there's no need to pretend this is anything more than an arrangement." Sarah nodded, clutching her small overnight bag. "Of course, I understand completely." She started walking toward the indicated hallway, but then stopped and turned back. "Though, there is something you should know." Bruno raised an eyebrow, noticing for the first time how Sarah's hands trembled slightly. "What is it?" Sarah began, then squared her shoulders. "I need to show you something in your office." Bruno's expression darkened. "My private office? That's off limits, even to my new wife." His tone carried a warning, but Sarah stood her ground. "Trust me, you'll want to see this." Without waiting for his response, she walked toward his home office with determined steps. Irritated and intrigued despite himself, Bruno followed her. His office was his sanctuary, filled with sensitive documents and contracts. None of the household staff was ever allowed inside. As he entered behind Sarah, he noticed she was heading straight for his supposedly secure computer. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, moving to stop her. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard with surprising speed and expertise. Before Bruno could intervene, his screens lit up with familiar code that he had been working on for months. "How did you—" he started, but Sarah cut him off. "Your security encryption had a vulnerability in the third layer," she said, her voice suddenly professional and confident. "I discovered it weeks ago while cleaning your office, but that's not the important part." She pulled up another screen, showing a series of transactions and documents. "This is what you need to see." Bruno stared at the screen, his face growing pale. There, laid out in meticulous detail, was evidence of systematic embezzlement from his company. Transactions he had never authorized, but that somehow bore his digital signature. "Someone's been stealing from you," Sarah explained, her earlier timidity completely gone. "They're using a sophisticated program to mimic your authorization patterns. I've been tracking it for months, ever since I noticed discrepancies in the cleaning schedules that lined up with unusual server activity." Bruno sank into his chair, his mind racing. "You're not really a housekeeper, are you?" Sarah smiled slightly. "I am a housekeeper. I'm also a self-taught cybersecurity expert. I've been working on computers since I was young, learning everything I could in between cleaning jobs. When I started working here, I noticed the security gaps immediately." "Why didn't you come to me directly?" Bruno demanded, still trying to process this revelation. Sarah's expression grew serious. "Because the transactions are being authorized using credentials that only 3 people have access to: you, your father, and Ian Matthews. The air seemed to leave the room as Bruno processed this information. His father and his best friend, the only two people he trusted completely, were the prime suspects in what appeared to be a massive financial fraud. I needed to get close enough to gather more evidence, Sarah continued. Besides, when Ian suggested this marriage arrangement, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. I never expected him to choose me. I thought he'd pick someone else from the staff. But when he did, she shrugged. I took it as a sign. Bruno stood up and began pacing, his wedding suit suddenly feeling too tight. So our marriage is just part of your investigation. Isn't it just part of a bet for you? Sarah countered, meeting his gaze steadily. For the first time, Bruno really looked at the woman he had married. Beyond the plus-sized figure that had initially made him dismiss her, he saw intelligence burning in her eyes and a quiet strength in her bearing that he had completely missed before. Why do you care? He asked finally. Why go to all this trouble for someone who barely noticed you existed? Sarah's expression softened slightly. Because it's the right thing to do, and because I know what it's like to have the people closest to you betray your trust. She touched the locket she wore, the same one she had kept hidden during the ceremony. My father was also a victim of financial fraud. He lost everything and... She stopped, emotion finally cracking her professional demeanor. Bruno found himself moving closer, drawn by the pain in her voice. And what? He couldn't handle the shame. He took his own life, Sarah finished quietly. I was young, but I promised myself I would never let something like that happen to anyone else if I could help it. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Bruno looked at the evidence on his screens again, then back at Sarah. His new wife was nothing like what he had assumed. She was not a simple housekeeper, taking advantage of a wealthy man's reckless bet. She was possibly the only person trying to protect him from a devastating betrayal. We'll need proof, he said finally. Concrete evidence that can't be disputed. Sarah nodded. I have a plan for that, but it will require us to maintain the appearance of a real marriage, at least for now. Anyone watching needs to believe this is genuine. Bruno ran a hand through his hair, his world thoroughly upended. So much for a simple arrangement, he muttered. Why, nothing about this marriage was ever going to be simple, Sarah replied, a hint of humor in her voice, though I doubt either of us expected this particular complication. As they stood in his office, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and the beginning of an unexpected partnership, Bruno realized that his wedding night had indeed brought a shocking discovery, just not the one anyone could have predicted. The question now was, how would they navigate this dangerous game of deception and investigation while maintaining their own elaborate pretense? And more importantly, could they trust each other when it seemed trust itself was a luxury they could no longer afford? The morning after their wedding night revelation found Bruno and Sarah sharing breakfast in his penthouse kitchen. The awkwardness of their arranged marriage had been replaced by a different kind of tension. The weight of their shared secret and the magnitude of what they were attempting to uncover. We need to act normal, Sarah said, spreading jam on her toast. Especially around Ian and your father. Any change in your behavior could alert them. Bruno watched her with newfound fascination. Gone was the timid housekeeper he had dismissed so easily. In her place was a sharp and strategic mind that matched his own. How do you suggest we do that? I'm not exactly known for my warmth toward the household staff. Sarah smiled slightly. Then we'll have to craft a believable story about how you're warming up to me. A gradual change that won't raise suspicions. She took a sip of her coffee. People love a good romance, especially an unlikely one. You seem very comfortable with deception, Bruno observed, not unkindly. Sarah's expression turned serious. When you grow up invisible to the wealthy people you serve, you learn a lot about playing roles. People see what they expect to see. Before Bruno could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from Ian. He wants to have dinner with us tonight. Says he wants to see how the happy couple is settling in. Perfect, Sarah said. Our first test. We'll need to convince him that this marriage might be turning into more than just a bet. Bruno frowned. And how exactly do we do that? By using what he already believes against him, Sarah explained. He thinks you're a privileged snob who's never looked beyond surface appearances. So we'll show him someone who's reluctantly discovering there might be more to his arranged wife than he thought. Throughout the day, they prepared for their performance. Sarah taught Bruno subtle signs of affection that would seem natural, the slight touch of a hand, the way to look at someone when they're speaking, the small courtesies that suggest growing fondness. The key is inconsistency, she explained. If we act perfectly in love, it'll seem fake. You should still show moments of discomfort or surprise at your own actions. That's what will make it believable. Bruno found himself impressed by her attention to detail. You've really thought this through. I've had a lot of time to observe how people behave, Sarah replied. When you're in the background, you see everything. That evening, Ian arrived at the penthouse, his usual confident smirk in place. Well, how's married life treating you both? Bruno met Sarah's eyes briefly before responding. It's not what I expected, he said carefully. Ian raised an eyebrow. Oh, do tell. Over dinner, they executed their plan perfectly. Bruno showed small signs of attention toward Sarah, passing her the salt before she asked, refilling her wine glass, actually listening when she spoke. Each gesture seemed to surprise him slightly, as if he wasn't quite aware he was doing it. Sarah, for her part, remained mostly quiet, but would occasionally make intelligent observations about business matters that caused both men to look at her with surprise. She played the role of someone trying not to overstep, while clearly having more to offer than anyone had noticed. "So I must say," Ian commented later, as they sat in the living room with after-dinner drinks, "this is not how I expected this evening to go. I thought there would be more tension." "Life is full of surprises," Bruno replied, noting how Ian's eyes narrowed slightly at the response. After Ian left, Bruno and Sarah retreated to his office to review their performance and continue their investigation. As Sarah worked at the computer, Bruno found himself studying her with growing curiosity. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked. "The cybersecurity, the social engineering. It's far beyond what most people could teach themselves." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "After my father died, I became obsessed with understanding how he had been deceived. I spent every free moment learning about financial systems, computer security, and human behavior. The libraries were free, and the internet was full of resources if you knew where to look. And the housekeeping was practical. It provided access to places and information that would otherwise be inaccessible." She turned to face him. "The wealthy rarely guard their secrets from the people they consider beneath their notice." Bruno felt a mix of admiration and shame at her words. How many times had he walked past her without a second glance? How many others like her had he dismissed based on their appearance or position? "I found something," Sarah said suddenly, her voice tense. She pointed to the screen where a series of transactions were displayed. "These transfers, they're sophisticated, but there's a pattern. They're not just stealing money, they're moving it through a series of shell companies before it reaches its final destination." Bruno leaned in closer, his shoulder brushing against hers as he studied the screen. "Can you trace where it ends up?" "Not yet," Sarah replied, her focus intense. "But look at the dates. The transfers always happen on specific days, and they're increasing in frequency." "They're getting bolder," Bruno realized, "or more desperate." "Either way, it's an opportunity," Sarah said. "The more transactions they make, the more chances we have to catch them." As they worked late into the night, Bruno became increasingly aware of a shift in his perception. The woman beside him, whom he had once seen as nothing more than an obligation, was proving to be a formidable ally. Her intelligence, determination, and quiet strength were impossible to ignore. When Sarah finally stood to leave, stretching after hours of work, Bruno found himself reluctant to end their collaboration. "We make a good team," he said, surprising himself with the admission. Sarah smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "We do, though I suspect that's not something either of us expected to discover." As she walked toward her room, Bruno called after her. "Sarah, thank you for caring enough to get involved when you didn't have to." She paused at the door, looking back at him. "Everyone deserves to have someone in their corner, Bruno. Even billionaires who make reckless bets." That night, as Bruno lay awake in his bed, he realized that his arranged marriage had become something far more complex than a simple business arrangement. He and Sarah were now partners in an intricate dance of deception, working together to uncover a betrayal while pretending to fall in love. The irony was that their pretense was beginning to feel less like an act with each passing hour. The question was, would they be able to maintain their focus on the investigation as the lines between performance and reality began to blur? The autumn rain drummed against the penthouse windows as Sarah sat at Bruno's desk, her eyes fixed on the computer screen. Weeks had passed since their wedding, and their investigation had uncovered more questions than answers. Bruno paced behind her, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "Something's not right," Sarah murmured, pulling up another series of transactions. "These new transfers, they're different, more erratic, almost like—" "Like what?" Bruno stopped pacing, moving to stand behind her chair. "Like they know someone's watching," Sarah finished, her voice tight with worry. She gestured to the screen. "Look at these patterns. They're deliberately trying to confuse the trail." Bruno leaned closer, his hand resting unconsciously on the back of Sarah's chair. The proximity between them had become natural over the weeks of working together, their initial awkwardness replaced by a comfortable familiarity that neither wanted to examine too closely. "Could they have detected your monitoring?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Sarah shook her head. "I've been careful, but—" She hesitated, then pulled out her locket, opening it to reveal a tiny USB drive. "I think someone's been in the office." Bruno straightened, alarmed. "What do you mean?" "Small things are out of place. Files moved slightly on your desk, the chair at a different angle than I left it. Someone's been searching for something." Before Bruno could respond, his phone buzzed with a message. His face darkened as he read it. "Ian wants to meet for lunch tomorrow. Just the two of us." Sarah turned to face him, their faces unusually close. "Be careful, if he suspects anything." "I know," Bruno replied softly. "We need to be more cautious." The next day, Bruno met Ian at their usual upscale restaurant, forcing himself to appear relaxed despite the tension coursing through him. Ian seemed his usual self, ordering expensive wine and making casual conversation about business. "So, how's married life treating you?" Ian asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "You seem different lately." Bruno took a careful sip of wine. "Different how?" "More distracted. You've been spending a lot of time in your home office." Ian leaned back, studying his friend. "And you've been asking questions about the company's financial procedures." "I'm taking more interest in the details," Bruno replied smoothly. "Sarah's actually quite knowledgeable about business matters. She's encouraged me to be more hands-on." Ian's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, yes, Sarah. Quite a surprise, isn't she? Who would have thought a simple housekeeper could have such influence on you?" The way Ian emphasized "simple housekeeper" made Bruno's hand tighten around his wine glass. The casual dismissal of Sarah, something he himself had been guilty of not long ago, now felt like a personal affront. "People can surprise you when you take the time to really see them," Bruno said, meeting Ian's gaze steadily. Ian's expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Indeed they can. Speaking of surprises, your father mentioned he's coming back from his business trip early. He wants to have dinner with you and your new bride." Bruno's heart rate increased, but he kept his face neutral. His father's unexpected return complicated things. Edward Patel was not a man who accepted changes to his plans easily, and his son's marriage to a housekeeper had definitely not been part of his plans. Back at the penthouse, Sarah was reviewing security footage when Bruno returned. One look at his face told her something was wrong. "It's what happened?" she asked, standing up. "My father's coming back," Bruno said, loosening his tie. "And Ian, I think he suspects something. He was too interested in how much time we're spending in the office." Sarah's face paled slightly. "We need to move faster then. I've been tracking the latest transfers, and I think I've found something." She pulled up a series of documents on the screen. "Look at these timestamps. They all correspond to late-night access to the company's secure server room." Bruno studied the data, then suddenly straightened. "Wait, these dates, they match the nights my father claimed he was out of the country." "Exactly," Sarah said softly. "But there's more. She pulled up another window showing security camera footage. "This is from last week. Watch." The grainy video showed a figure entering the server room using high-level security credentials. The person's face wasn't visible, but their movements were familiar to Bruno. "That's Ian's walk," he said, his voice hollow. "He and my father, they're working together." Sarah nodded grimly. "It appears so, but we still don't know why. The amount of money they're moving. It's massive, but it's not being stolen outright. It's being funneled somewhere specific." Bruno sank into a chair, the weight of betrayal heavy on his shoulders. Sarah moved to stand beside him, hesitating before placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know how much they both mean to you." Bruno reached up, covering her hand with his own. The gesture was automatic, born of a growing intimacy neither had anticipated. "You know what's strange? Right now you're the only person I trust completely, and a few weeks ago I barely knew you existed." Sarah's breath caught at his words, and for a moment they stayed frozen in that position, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging between them. Then Bruno's phone buzzed again, another message from Ian. The spell broken, Sarah stepped back, returning to business mode. "We need to be ready before your father arrives. If they're both involved, they might be planning something big." Bruno stood, his expression hardening with determination. "Then we'll be ready for them. But first—" He turned to Sarah, his eyes serious. "We need to talk about us." "Us?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "This thing between us, this connection, it's not just part of the act anymore, is it?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, though her heart was racing. "No," she admitted. "It's not." Before either could say more, a notification popped up on the computer screen, an alert showing another large transfer in progress. Their personal revelation would have to wait. They had work to do. As they turned back to the investigation, both were acutely aware that they were now protecting more than just Bruno's company. They were protecting whatever this fragile, unexpected thing between them was becoming. A connection forged in deception, but growing into something real and precious. The question was, could they uncover the truth about the betrayal without losing everything else in the process? The evening of Edward Patel's return arrived with an atmosphere of barely contained tension. The penthouse had been prepared for a formal dinner, the table set with expensive china that Sarah herself had once polished as a housekeeper. Now she sat at that same table as Bruno's wife, feeling the weight of Edward's calculating gaze. "I must say," Edward began, cutting into his perfectly cooked steak, "this is not the welcome dinner I expected to have upon my return." Bruno sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid. "Things change, father." "Indeed they do." Edward's eyes moved to Sarah, who met his gaze with quiet dignity. "Though I must admit, some changes are more surprising than others." Ian, who had also been invited to the dinner, watched the exchange with poorly concealed interest. "Sarah has been quite the revelation, haven't you, my dear?" Sarah took a small sip of wine before responding. "I simply try to be myself, Mr. Matthews. Please, call me Ian. We're all family now, aren't we?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. The dinner continued with carefully measured conversations, each word feeling like a move in an elaborate chess game. Sarah noticed how Edward and Ian exchanged subtle glances throughout the meal, their synchronized movements confirming her suspicions about their collaboration. As dessert was being served, Edward cleared his throat. "Son, there's something we need to discuss. About the company's future." Bruno tensed slightly. "What about it?" "I've been reviewing our holdings, and I believe it's time for some significant restructuring. Ian has been helping me identify areas where we could be more efficient." Sarah watched as Bruno's hand tightened around his fork. She knew what they had discovered, that the restructuring was likely a cover for their massive financial scheme. "What kind of restructuring?" Bruno asked, his voice carefully neutral. Edward pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "I've drawn up some proposals. They'll require your signature, of course, as CEO, but I assure you, these changes are necessary for the company's survival." As Edward spread the documents across the table, Sarah's trained eye caught sight of familiar patterns in the financial statements. the same patterns she had been tracking in their investigation. "Gus, these seem quite extensive," Bruno commented, flipping through the pages. "I'll need time to review them properly." "Time is a luxury we don't have," Ian interjected smoothly. "The market is volatile. We need to act quickly." Sarah noticed a bead of sweat on Ian's forehead, the first crack in his usual composed demeanor. Something about their timeline had changed. "Surely a few days won't make a difference," she said, speaking up for the first time in a while. Given the scope of these changes, Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. "I wasn't aware you had expertise in corporate restructuring, my dear." "There's a lot you don't know about me, Mr. Patel," Sarah replied calmly, though her heart was racing. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Bruno reached under the table and squeezed Sarah's hand, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by either Edward or Ian. "Well," Edward said, leaning back in his chair, "it seems my son's unusual marriage has had more of an effect than I anticipated." "What's that supposed to mean?" Bruno demanded, his patience finally wearing thin. "It means, son, that perhaps it's time for complete honesty." Edward's expression hardened. "We know what you and your wife have been investigating." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah felt her blood run cold, but she maintained her composure. Bruno's grip on her hand tightened. "How long have you known?" Bruno asked quietly. Ian smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Long enough. Did you really think we wouldn't notice someone probing our secure servers? Though I must admit, Sarah's skills impressed us. For a housekeeper, you're remarkably adept at cybersecurity." "She's not just a housekeeper," Bruno said, his voice carrying a note of pride that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "No," Edward agreed. "She's much more dangerous than that. The question is, what do we do about it?" The threat in his words was unmistakable. Sarah felt Bruno tense beside her, ready to defend her, but she squeezed his hand, silently urging him to wait. "Before you do anything," Sarah said, her voice steady, "you should know that we've secured evidence of every transaction, every shell company, every unauthorized access to the company's systems. If anything happens to either of us, that information goes public immediately." Edward's expression didn't change, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Sarah reached for her ever-present locket, opening it to reveal not just the USB drive, but a small screen showing a countdown timer. "This dead man's switch is connected to servers across the globe. Miss one check-in, and everything gets exposed." Ian's composure finally cracked. "Edward, we need to think about this carefully." "There's nothing to think about," Edward snapped. "Do you realize what you've done?" This last part was directed at Bruno. "The company is at stake." "The company?" Bruno stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Or your illegal scheme? What are you really doing with all that money, Father?" For the first time, something like fear flickered across Edward's face. He exchanged a look with Ian, who nodded slightly. "Show them," Ian said quietly. Edward hesitated, then pulled out his phone, pulling up a series of documents. "What you've discovered, it's not what you think. The money isn't being stolen. It's being used to protect everything we've built." As Edward began to explain, Sarah and Bruno realized they had uncovered something far more complex than simple embezzlement, but the truth would prove to be more dangerous than anything they had imagined. The dinner that had begun with subtle tensions was about to explode into a confrontation that would change everything, not just for the company, but for all of their lives. And in the midst of it all, Bruno and Sarah found themselves facing a choice: trust in the love that had grown between them, or let the weight of family secrets tear them apart. "It started with a threat," Edward began, his usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of his confession. "Someone discovered a vulnerability in our company's main product, a flaw that could compromise millions of users' data." Bruno felt the blood drain from his face. Their company's security software protected some of the largest corporations in the world. A serious vulnerability could be catastrophic. "Why didn't you tell me?" Bruno demanded. "Because the people who found it weren't white hat hackers," Ian explained. "They wanted money, enormous sums, to keep quiet. They threatened to release the vulnerability to the highest bidder if we didn't pay." Sarah's mind raced, connecting the dots. "The regular transfers, you're paying blackmail." Edward nodded grimly. We couldn't risk fixing the vulnerability openly. It would have required a complete system overhaul, and the mere hint of a security flaw would have destroyed public trust. Our stock would have plummeted. Thousands would have lost their jobs. So you chose to pay, Bruno said, his voice hollow. We created a complex payment system to hide the transactions, Ian added. The shell companies, the irregular transfers, all designed to prevent anyone from tracking the payments back to us. Sarah sat forward, her professional instincts kicking in. But something's changed, hasn't it? The pattern of transfers has become more erratic lately. Edward and Ian exchanged worried looks. They're demanding more, Ian admitted. Much more. And they're threatening to expose everything, not just the vulnerability, but the payments too. That's why you need my signature, Bruno realized. You're running out of ways to move the money without raising suspicions. Sarah's hand went to her locket, her mind working furiously. Let me see the vulnerability, she said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. What? Edward asked. I want to see the actual code, the technical details of the flaw they found. Her voice was firm, professional. I might be able to help. Ian laughed bitterly. No offense, but this is beyond a self-taught. Show her, Bruno interrupted, his faith in Sarah absolute. Edward hesitated, then nodded to Ian, who pulled out a laptop and brought up a series of technical documents. Sarah studied them intently, her expression growing more focused with each passing minute. This is elegant, she murmured, almost admiringly. The way they've hidden it. But wait. She sat up straighter. Something's not right. What do you mean? Bruno moved to look over her shoulder. This vulnerability, it's too perfect, too precisely hidden to have been found accidentally. Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard. In fact, there it is. This wasn't discovered by outsiders. This was planted. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Planted? Edward's voice was barely a whisper. By whom? Sarah turned the laptop around, showing them a snippet of code. See these markers. This is a signature. Someone on your development team deliberately created this vulnerability. But that means, Bruno started. The blackmailers are inside the company, Sarah finished. They created the threat so they could profit from it. Ian sank into his chair, looking suddenly old. All this time we've been paying our own people. The transfers, Edward said suddenly, they always aligned with our internal code review schedule. That's how they knew when to make their demands. They could see when we were close to discovering the vulnerability naturally. Bruno stood up and began pacing. We need to find them. Now. We can't move too quickly, Sarah cautioned. If they realize we know, they might release everything anyway, Ian finished. The vulnerability, the payments, all of it. Edward looked at Sarah with new respect. You found in minutes what we couldn't discover in months. How? Because I know what it's like to be the person no one suspects, Sarah replied quietly. The invisible one who sees everything. Your blackmailers are hiding in plain sight, just like I was. Bruno stopped pacing and turned to Sarah, a plan forming. Then we use that. We let them think they're still invisible while we set a trap. Sarah nodded slowly. We need to make them think they've won, that their latest demand has pushed you exactly where they want you. The restructuring documents, Edward realized. If we appear to be moving forward with those, they'll think their plan is working, Ian finished. But how do we identify them? Sarah smiled slightly. By giving them exactly what they want, but with a twist they won't expect. As they began to formulate their plan, Bruno watched Sarah work, her earlier facade of timidity completely gone. In its place was a confident, brilliant woman who had not only uncovered a complex conspiracy, but was now instrumental in solving it. The irony wasn't lost on him. His father and best friend had spent months trying to protect the company from external threats, while the woman they had all underestimated was proving to be its salvation. But as they worked late into the night, developing their strategy, a new worry gnawed at Bruno. Sarah had put herself at risk by revealing her capabilities. Once this was over, once the blackmailers were caught, she wouldn't be able to go back to being invisible. And something in the way she kept touching her locket made him wonder if she was still holding on to one last secret. As dawn approached, their plan was set. They would appear to comply with the blackmailer's demands while secretly laying a trap that would expose their identities. But success would require perfect timing, complete trust, and a willingness to risk everything. Looking at Sarah in the soft morning light, Bruno realized that his arranged marriage had become something he never expected, a true partnership. The only question was, would they survive what was coming next? The trap was set. Bruno had publicly announced the company restructuring, making sure word spread through the office that he was signing the documents his father had prepared. Sarah had returned to her role as the quiet, unassuming wife, though now her presence in the company's headquarters raised curious whispers rather than dismissive glances. They didn't have to wait long for the blackmailers to make their move. Late one evening, as Bruno worked alone in his office, his computer screen suddenly went black. When it flickered back to life, a message appeared: "Wire the money by midnight, or everything goes public." Bruno pressed a button under his desk, the signal Sarah had been waiting for. In a small monitoring room down the hall, she sprang into action, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards. "They're accessing the system now," she spoke into her headset, where Edward and Ian waited with the security team. Just like we predicted. The blackmailers, confident in their success, didn't realize their supposedly secure connection was being traced. Sarah had modified the company's security protocols, creating a false sense of vulnerability while actually strengthening their ability to track unauthorized access. "I got them," Sarah announced after several tense minutes. "They're accessing from the development team's floor, Section C." Bruno was already moving, joined by security personnel who had been strategically positioned throughout the building. As they approached Section C, Sarah's voice came through his earpiece. "Wait," she said suddenly. "Something's wrong. The signal. It's splitting." Before Bruno could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the building. Emergency lights flashed, and security doors slammed shut. "It's a diversion," Sarah realized. "They're not in Section C. They're heading for the main server room." Bruno changed direction, running toward the server room with his security team. But when they arrived, the door was already open, and inside they found an unexpected scene. Two figures stood at the main console, both wearing maintenance uniforms, both previously invisible to the company's elite. One was an older man with graying hair, the other a younger woman. Bruno recognized them as part of the cleaning staff, people who had worked in the building for years without anyone paying them any attention. "Don't move," Bruno commanded, as security surrounded them. The older man laughed bitterly. "Or what? You'll fire us? Take away our minimum wage jobs?" "Why?" Bruno asked, genuinely wanting to understand. "So it's because people like you never see people like us," the woman answered, her voice hard. "We maintain your systems, clean your offices, know all your security codes, but we're nothing to you. So we decided to make you pay for your blindness." "By threatening to destroy the company, put thousands of other workers at risk," Bruno challenged. "Sometimes you have to break something to fix it," the older man said. Suddenly, Sarah's voice came through the speakers. "I'd like my father's company." The older man froze, recognition flickering across his face. "What did you say?" Sarah walked into the server room, her expression both sad and determined. "You worked for my father's company before it collapsed. I recognized your coding style. It's the same technique that was used to plant the vulnerability that destroyed his business." The man's face paled. "Thompson, you're Richard Thompson's daughter." "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "Are the same Richard Thompson who killed himself after his company was destroyed by a planted security flaw. I never knew who was responsible, until now." The revelation hung heavy in the air. The older man seemed to age years in moments, his shoulders sagging. "Your father refused to sell," he said finally. "We were going to lose our jobs to automation. I thought if I could just scare him enough." "But it went wrong," Sarah finished. "The vulnerability was discovered. The company collapsed, and hundreds lost their jobs anyway, including you." "So you came here," Bruno realized, "to try the same scheme again. But bigger this time," the woman added defiantly. "With enough money to make sure we'd never be invisible again." As security led them away, Bruno turned to Sarah, seeing the emotion she was fighting to control. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. But that's what was in your locket all along, wasn't it? The connection to my company's code? Sarah nodded. When I started working here and saw the same patterns, I knew I had to find out the truth. I never imagined it would lead to this. Later that night, after the arrests had been made and the real vulnerability had been patched, Bruno and Sarah stood in his office, looking out over the city lights. "I owe you an apology," Edward said, joining them with Ian. "Thanks both of you. We were so focused on external threats that we never saw the truth right in front of us." "None of us did," Ian added. "Well, except Sarah. You saw everything, didn't you?" Sarah smiled slightly. "When you're invisible, you learn to see what others miss. But being invisible can also make you bitter, make you want to hurt those who never saw you. I chose a different path. You chose to protect the very people who overlooked you," Bruno said softly. "Including me." Sarah turned to face him. "Maybe I was just waiting for someone to finally see me." Bruno took both her hands in his. "I see you now. I see your brilliance, your strength, your compassion, and I'm not just talking about your skills or how you helped save the company. I'm talking about you, Sarah, the real you." "The question is," Ian interrupted with a knowing smile, "what happens now? The terms of your arranged marriage only required a year." Bruno and Sarah looked at each other, years of understanding passing between them in a moment. "I think," Bruno said slowly, "we might need to renegotiate those terms." "Oh." Sarah's eyes sparkled with amusement. "What did you have in mind?" "Something more permanent, if you're interested." Sarah pretended to consider it. "Well, I suppose someone needs to keep an eye on your security systems. Is that a yes?" Instead of answering, Sarah reached up and pulled Bruno into a kiss, their first real kiss, not for show or pretense, but for them. Edward cleared his throat. "I suppose this means I'll need to plan a proper wedding reception, one where the bride isn't just the housekeeper, but the woman who saved our company." "No," Bruno said firmly, still holding Sarah close. "One where she's simply herself. That's more than enough." As Ian and Edward left them alone, Sarah and Bruno remained by the window, the city lights twinkling below like stars. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "for a marriage that started as a bet, this turned out rather well." Bruno chuckled. "I think I'm the one who won that bet, though not in any way I expected." "Oh, how so?" "I bet against finding love in an arranged marriage. I've never been happier to lose." Sarah leaned into his embrace, her locket now holding only memories rather than secrets. They had both started this journey hiding behind facades, he as the arrogant billionaire, she as the invisible housekeeper. But in finding the truth about others, they had also found the truth about themselves. And sometimes, they discovered, the greatest revelations come not from unraveling complex conspiracies, but from simply learning to see what was there all along. In the end, their story wasn't just about uncovering a plot or saving a company. It was about two people who discovered that true value isn't measured in bank accounts or social status, but in the courage to be seen for who you really are, and the wisdom to see others in return. Bruno and Sarah had started with a marriage of convenience, orchestrated by a reckless bet. They ended with something far more precious, a partnership forged in trust, strengthened by adversity, and transformed by love. And that, they both agreed, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. Thank you for watching this heart-stirring story. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought of the story. Also, click on the video appearing on your screen to continue the journey with us. See you in the next story.